Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to AP US History. We look today at how the United States got involved in the First World War. Although President Wilson did not want the United States getting involved in the Great War, he said that America should maintain strict neutrality in both thought and deed. After all, war would be expensive and deadly, and it wasn't really any of America's business anyway. After all, the quid pro quo of the Monroe Doctrine had essentially been that if Europe would stay out of the Western Hemisphere, which we promised to protect, we would stay out of the rest of the world and let Europe manage their own business. So if Europeans wanted to fight one another, that was their problem and not ours. And most Americans felt the same way and could be described as isolationists, and people who wanted to stay isolated, separated from this conflict overseas. And besides, even if we wanted to help someone, it might be hard to choose whom. After all, as a nation of immigrants, there were many people in America from countries on both sides of the conflict. Of course, clearly many English Americans, some French Americans, but also German Americans, Italian Americans, Russian Americans, people that Theodore Roosevelt described as hyphenated Americans, a term he used as one of criticism, saying once you came to America, you should become fully American. But regardless, there were many people who did sympathize with one country or the other, on one side or the other. Although, overall, the preference was probably for the Allies. Many Americans are descended from the British Isles. Our culture and government are largely British. But that said, there were many people who of German or other ancestry too. But over time, as the war progressed, and certainly once the United States did get involved in it, German Americans, and there were a lot, came to be harassed. Prejudice became extreme against Germans. German was at one point the second most spoken language in America. There were German language schools, German language newspapers, and many other institutions of German culture. That went away almost immediately once the U.S. did enter World War I. Indeed, some states even made it illegal to speak in German. And this could be extreme forms like that, or even ways that today might seem a little bit silly. But a lot of things in America, especially foods, have German names. Anybody ever eat pickled cabbage?
Pickled cabbage?
Yeah, some people like it. Some people put it on their hot dogs or...
I've had a bratwurst.
Sauerkraut?
Yeah, sauerkraut. But that's a very German-sounding name. During World War I, we called it Liberty Cabbage.
Wait, what do they call it? Is bratwurst German? So what do they call that?
My guess would be a Liberty sausage.
Liberty sausage.
Yeah. Here's a time of liberty. Of course, what have we here?
Hamburger.
A hamburger, but it's named for Hamburg, a major port city in Germany. These two had to be Liberty sandwiches. Or perhaps a Salisbury steak sandwich. A Salisbury steak being another term for a ground beef patty. Having been presented as health food at one point by a man named Salisbury, said because it was cut up, it would be easier to digest than a solid steak you had to chew or something. Many dogs have German names. Who's this little long, low fellow?
Dachshund.
He's a Dachshund. Or what do some other people call him?
Wiener dog.
A Wiener dog. Wiener, though, it should really be pronounced Wiener. It means something from Vienna, the capital of Austria. So, two unacceptable names for who's now called a Liberty pup. People changed their family names. Schmidts became Smiths. Muellers became Millers. Browns became Brown, which sounds the same but is spelled differently. If anyone's seen the Back to the Future movies, Back to the Future 3 reveals Dr. Brown's father changed their family name from von Braun during the First World War. Even the British royal family of German ancestry changed their family name from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to Windsor after their favorite castle. In Britain, German Shepherd dogs are still called Alsatians. The U.S., of course, wanted to trade with both sides in the war. having always felt that as a neutral country, we had the right to trade with anyone, an idea known as freedom of the seas. But both sides interfered with this. Britain's Royal Navy, very early in the war, blockaded Germany, trying to keep them from getting any supplies from elsewhere. Germany eventually responded in 1915 with unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking any ship that got too close to Britain. For one thing, the British had sometimes had merchant ships with disguised guns on them when a submarine sailed up close to a merchant ship and gave the people the opportunity to evacuate before they sank it, which was considered good manners at first. The British would just pull out their concealed guns and sink the submarine, so they quit giving warning. And of the ships sunk by this policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, by far the most famous was the passenger ship Lusitania. Although it turns out they were secretly and illegally carrying weapons in the hold of the ship too. You're not being supposed to carry weapons in a passenger ship. Now, before the Lusitania sailed from America to Britain, the German embassy in America took out advertisements warning people not to sail on the Lusitania, essentially saying, we recommend you not sail on the ship because we're probably going to sink it. But if you've learned anything, it's that you do not tell an American where he cannot go. So many Americans sailed on the Lusitania, and 128 of them were killed when the ship was torpedoed off the coast of Ireland. Among the 1,200 people who died, and 128 were Americans. This and the sinking of other civilian ships from many nationalities was so controversial that Germany did eventually abandon the policy of unrestricted submarine warfare in March of 1916, at least for now. Now, after the sinking of the Lusitania, many Americans did want to go to war, but Wilson refused, saying there is such a thing as a man being too proud to fight. There is such a thing as a nation being so right that it does not need to convince others by force that it is right. We're so right we don't even have to prove it. But Wilson did say Germany had been wrong to do what it did. He criticized unrestricted submarine warfare, and for some Americans, even that criticism went too far, including for Wilson's Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, who felt that Wilson was being hypocritical for criticizing Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare, but not criticizing Britain's blockade of Germany. So he resigned in protest. Now, in the election of 1916, Wilson was re-elected, defeating Charles Evans Hughes, who stepped down from the Supreme Court to run for president, although he will later return to the Supreme Court in 1930 as Chief Justice. And among Wilson's slogans was, "He kept us out of war." Although some Americans did feel that was a mistake, Theodore Roosevelt condemned him as a mollycoddle for having avoided conflict. But after the election, things got worse. In 1917, the British intercepted a German telegram. Britain had cut Germany's telegraph line when the war began, so they were able to tap into German messages sent along the remaining transatlantic telegraph lines. Germany sent their messages in code, but the British broke their code and passed on a telegram from Arthur Zimmermann, Germany's foreign secretary, which he was sending to Germany's ambassador in Mexico. The Zimmermann telegram, or Zimmermann Note, made an offer to Mexico, saying that if Mexico would invade the United States, even though the U.S. and Mexico were at peace officially, Germany would help Mexico seize back some of the land they had lost to James K. Polk. Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, maybe more. And to be fair, Mexico had plenty of reason to be mad at the United States. At this point, Blackjack Pershing still had 10,000 men in northern Mexico chasing Pancho Villa, and the U.S. Marines had occupied Veracruz and Tampico a few years before that. This, though, was obviously seen as a pretty dirty trick. We're officially at peace with Mexico. We're officially neutral toward Germany. And for Germany to propose this stab in the back infuriated many Americans. Mexico declined this offer. Again, Americans were furious that it had been made. And in March, Germany renewed their policy of unrestricted submarine warfare and sank even more ships as part of their blockade of Britain, including some American ships. So not just sinking foreign ships with American passengers, but sinking American ships outright in March of 1917, violating our freedom of the seas and the right of a neutral country, especially if it's us, to sail wherever they like. And while Wilson felt that war was not a good thing, he felt compelled to request a declaration of war from Congress. Congress voted to declare war April 6, 1917, although even now there were many Americans against the war. Of them, the one best remembered today was a congresswoman from Montana. Jeannette Rankin, a Republican from Montana, was the first woman to serve in Congress. And she said, as bad as Germany was, war was not the answer. She was a committed pacifist who refused to vote for the declaration of war. I guess Montana didn't appreciate it. She did not get reelected in 1918. Although she was reelected many years later in 1940, in time to be the only member of the House of Representatives to vote against declaring war in World War II. Agree with her or not, she at least was consistent. And so, at Wilson's behest, America entered the Great War, but as a different kind of war, not a war for conquest or power or prestige, but to defeat the tyrants who had begun the war, to make the world safe for democracy. Indeed, Wilson said this great war would be the last war, a war to end war. At the time America entered the war, Germany in 1917 did have a new plan to end the war, before the war bled them dry or they starved to death behind the British blockade. There's 3 steps to the German plan. Number 1, take Russia out of the war. Number 2, take Britain out of the war. And number 3, capture Paris. So a simple plan, just defeat your 3 main enemies. But there was, of course, more to it than that. Russia, although huge, was in some ways weak. Their army was poorly equipped, had suffered a number of defeats. The average Russian person was poor and desperate. And so, to get Russia out of the war, Germans found an exiled communist agitator named Vladimir Lenin and sneaked him to the Russian border in a sealed train car with no windows, or at least the windows covered, so he couldn't infect Germany with communism by looking out the window as he passed through on the train. They gave him some money and said, go cause some trouble. And later in 1917, Russia would experience 2 revolutions, the second of which put the communists in charge, at least more or less. There would then be a civil war in Russia lasting to about 1922, but with Lenin's Bolshevik faction of the communists in charge. They arrested and eventually killed the entire Russian family, including the pet dog, just to be safe. And then, to concentrate on their own civil war, they made their own peace treaty with Germany. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in early 1918 got Russia out of the war and gave a lot of Russia's western land to Germany and Austria-Hungary. To defeat Britain, Germany, as I've already mentioned, renewed their policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, hoping to starve Britain out of the war. Britain had a huge empire, but most of what it produced had to sail to Britain. They also bombed Britain with Zeppelins, nearly starving Britain out of the war. As I mentioned too, they also tried to provoke an uprising in Ireland, hoping to distract Britain in that way. Now, unrestricted submarine warfare did bring America into the war. And Germany knew that was quite possible. Indeed, one reason for the Zimmermann Note was hoping to keep America distracted from the possibility of war with Germany. But plus Germany thought, war with Mexico or not, the U.S. with a pretty small army, under 30,000 men, would take so long to get ready that we couldn't get to Europe in time to make a difference. As General Ludendorff said, what can America do? She cannot come over here. I do not give a damn about America. But America did do things. Among other things, we began sending many supplies to Britain, and did so as part of a convoy system, with many supply ships protected by many warships. And it was not just the U.S. that did this. Canada and Britain's other colonies supplied them many things too. But in the convoy system, eventually, mostly dealt with the U-boat blockade. For one thing, submarines in those days couldn't stay underwater very long. They would stay on the surface, see an enemy from a distance, then go underwater, sneak up on them, and torpedo them. If you had fast-moving ships patrolling in advance of the rest of your convoy, they could often locate the submarines, or at least scare them away before the main ships got too close. Still, with Russia out of the war, and Britain in trouble at least, Germany by mid-1918 was able to take all those soldiers who'd been fighting in the east against Russia and throw them into an all-out attack on Paris, led by stormtroopers, dedicated German soldiers chosen for their size and their ferocity, and given weapons meant to overwhelm enemy trenches. They developed submachine guns, a machine gun one man could carry. They gave them whole sacks of hand grenades. They gave them flamethrowers, other weapons meant for shock tactics. And the French army, exhausted after many years of war, especially the terribly bloody Battle of Verdun, suffered massive mutinies. Many units, sometimes whole divisions of 10,000 men, refused to fight back. By the summer of 1918, it looked as if Paris would fall and the Central Powers would win. At this point, the American Expeditionary Force arrived, under the command of General Blackjack Pershing, to repay France for their help in the Revolution 140 years before. Upon his arrival in France, General Pershing said, "Lafayette, we are here. We come to repay the favor." Now, the AEF was not necessarily that well trained or that well equipped, and Americans were maybe not significantly better soldiers than their enemies overall. But American soldiers were ready to fight, had not suffered 4 years of exhaustion and misery, had not become bitter by the stalemate of trench warfare. And reinforced by the American Expeditionary Force, the Allies stopped the attack on Paris. Americans were involved in 3 major battles and some other smaller ones in the process of stopping the Germans. The first major battle for Americans in World War I was the Battle of Château-Thierry. Another was Belleau Wood, where the U.S. Marines fought so hard and lost so many lives that afterwards the French government gave Belleau Wood to the United States. So today there is a small part of America in northern France. And American troops fought along the Marne River, where the German advance was stopped for good. And once the Germans were stopped, the Allies began preparing a counterattack, which took place along the Meuse River and in the Argonne Forest, so it's often known as the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. This began on September 26, 1918, and would be the last major offensive of the war. And it would be famous for the heroism of the eager American troops, including that of the most decorated soldier of the war, at least from America, Corporal Alvin York, from East Tennessee, a backwoodsman whose family farm was poor. He had to supplement their diet by hunting. He was a crack shot, even promoted to a shooting instructor while still in basic training. Now, he was also a devout Christian. After a friend of his was killed in a bar fight, he'd become much more religious. Indeed, was entirely opposed to war. So when he was drafted, he declared himself to be a conscientious objector, but was eventually, and a conscientious objector is someone who refuses to fight on the grounds that war is always wrong. Quakers are famous as conscientious objectors, dating to the 1600s, and are typically exempt from military service. Jehovah's Witnesses, Amish, Mennonites, Hutterites are typically conscientious objectors as well. Although during World War I, the U.S. government had very little sympathy for conscientious objectors, and they were typically sent to prison. And Alvin York was eventually convinced there were times when fighting is acceptable. And once he went to war, and he was, as a crack shot, an outstanding soldier. On October 8, 1918, during the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, York was sent out as part of a small patrol to try to destroy a German machine gun nest. Several of the men in his patrol were killed. The rest hid, leaving York as a sharpshooter and the highest-ranking soldier left, able to move. Moved around the battlefield, hiding behind piles of dirt and in trenches, picking off the machine gunners, 50 or 60 yards away, eventually shooting 25 German soldiers. He was firing from so many different positions that the Germans thought they were surrounded. 132 others surrendered to him alone. And for this, he received, among other things, the Medal of Honor, many other American medals, a number of foreign ones as well, in becoming the most decorated American soldier of the war. And later the subject of one of the great movies of the 20th century. In another instance, an American battalion was ordered to take a German position along with 2 other units. This particular battalion took its objective, but the other units did not. And the one battalion who made it where it was supposed to ended up surrounded and trapped by the Germans. Their communication lines were cut. They'd actually had a telephone line they ran behind them off a spool, but of course the Germans cut the telephone lines. Because American forces didn't know where they were, American artillery firing into Germans began to hit them too. They sent runners to try to take a message back to Allied lines, but the Germans shot the runners. They were left with a basket of carrier pigeons. Even in 1918, people still communicated at times with messages tied to the leg of a carrier pigeon, trained to fly back to headquarters. So they put a message in the leg of a pigeon, let it go, and the Germans shot it. And another pigeon, until they were down to their last pigeon, named Cher Ami. They tied a message to that pigeon. Cher Ami flew up and perched in a tree, where the Germans shot her leg off, which scared her badly enough. She then flew back home, where she was later given an artificial leg, and delivered the message saying where the Americans were. The Allied bombardment stopped, and eventually, after 6 days, reinforcements arrived and rescued the survivors. Cher Ami, after dying a few years later, was stuffed, and you can visit her next time you're at the Smithsonian Institution to save the lost battalion. And while many men were killed, and many of the survivors got medals of honor and other awards, and they distracted the Germans long enough for the Allies to push farther through German lines elsewhere. So, they proved to be very important in the Meuse-Argonne Offensive anyway. Even Cher Ami receives a French medal, the Croix de Guerre, the Cross of War. And as the German army was pushed back, Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire made separate peaces with the Allies. The Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed as Czechs and Slovaks and Poles and Hungarians and other ethnic groups declared themselves independent from Vienna. Shortly afterwards, Karl I, the great-nephew of Emperor Franz Joseph, abdicated. In Germany, the High Seas Fleet was ordered out of Kiel for one final battle against the Royal Navy. The admirals knew it was a suicide mission, but they wanted to go down with their ships in a blaze of glory. But the sailors, knowing it was hopeless, refused. They revolted, mutinied, seized control of the port city of Kiel. Kaiser Wilhelm II fled to the Netherlands, and a temporary government was set up early in November, who agreed to an armistice, to a ceasefire. The armistice was signed at 11:11 in the morning on the 11th of November, 1918. 11:11 on 11:11. They felt they were very clever. Ending the fighting and effectively ending the war. Although it's worth pointing out, this was not due to a crushing, decisive military defeat. When the battle ended, when the war ended, almost all the battle lines were still in Belgium and northern France. Allied forces only got into one teeny tiny corner of Germany, and almost all the fighting was still in France and Belgium when the fighting ended. The Germans knew they were losing, they were exhausted, and there were rebellions within their country, but they hadn't been totally crushed, a point that's going to matter a lot here in a few years. But the end of the war was a great moment, celebrated around the world as Armistice Day at the time, and celebrated ever since in many countries, although often under new names today. What day do we now celebrate in America on November 11th?
Celebrate the day on November 11th?
Well, we do. A day we call Veterans Day.
Oh.
Although in America, that honors all of our veterans. In many Allied countries, what they call Remembrance Day commemorates lives lost in war. The U.S. commemorates our lost soldiers on Memorial Day, a tradition dating back to remembering Union soldiers after the Civil War.